Hey, how's it? So, over the past couple of videos, we've been discussing how to prepare your garden for planting. We've gone through from orienting your garden beds according to the sun to getting everything prepped in terms of compost and tilling and all that sort of stuff. We've even discussed infrastructure. Now's pretty much a good time to start discussing, okay, how to plant out, or what are the different ways to plant out a garden bed? What are the different ways that you can go about this? So this is going to be part one of a 2-video series where we're going to discuss specifically that. Part one will talk about all the different types of planting out of the garden bed, all the different methods, and then in part two we're just going to discuss basically all the considerations that'll be somewhat applicable to all of those methods. So let's get straight into the video. Okay, so the first method, I suppose, the first technique that we're going to discuss is square foot gardening. I've mentioned this a few times on this channel, right? Square foot gardening is actually really cool. What square foot gardening attempts to do is try to make use of the available space in the most efficient manner. What it does is it divides the area up into 300 by 300 or 1 foot by 1 foot squares. Each square is then allocated to something. You can do the entire bed as a monocrop or a whole bunch of different stuff. That doesn't really matter too much. All it tries to do is say, okay, we have this grid of square feet or 300 by 300 more squares, and each of these squares can be planted up in X fashion. Each crop has its own spatial requirements no matter where you are. So what happens is then in each of these squares you try and do a high intensity planting method in these little squares. So for example, right, you're going to have 16 radishes per square foot. You'll have 1 tomato per square foot. You'll have 1 squash per square foot, depending on the variety. Some varieties you need like 4 squares just because they get so large. And that sort of thing. Like even like spring onions, you'll end up planting up 16. So it's 4 rows of 4 within each of these squares. So you can see how quickly that space gets planted out, and it's really cool if you do it efficiently. So it's really nice. However, it should be noted, right, with this whole square foot gardening approach, when you typically do it, a lot of people try and do it sort of in raised garden beds. I've tried it. I don't really have a raised garden bed apart from the sunflowers, but but in these other areas where I have been trying this method out, I have actually had some pretty good success where I applied correctly. What I have found is, because you're planting so close together, if you don't organize the plants correctly within this grid, right? Let's say here you're planting spring onions, and then here you're planting, let's say, like a kale or something else that grows very tall and leafy and then ends up shading other stuff out. Then you're going to have a bad time. So that's something that you really need to consider. And I'll discuss it a little bit more in detail a bit later. But square foot gardening is such a cool way to maximize the planting that you do if you have a very limited amount of space. Let's say you are a balcony gardener, or you have only a single raised bed that you can garden in, or let's say you just have a small yard, or a few containers, and I don't know, maybe those containers are big enough and you can actually get like a little bit of a grid in there. Square foot gardening becomes very appropriate for the situation. So long story short, with square foot gardening, all you want to do is arrange a grid in a foot. Each block within the grid will be a foot by a foot, or 300 by 300. That's what it translates to. And then you'll have all these crops being planted within them. So maybe one block you'll have spinach, one block you'll have carrots, one block you'll have I don't know, it doesn't really matter. Whatever you want to do, really. But it's really cool. And like I mentioned, you don't have to just do a whole bunch of different stuff. You can actually use the square foot gardening method to monocrop and just get like a whole ton of radishes or spring onions, or to plant out your tomatoes or whatever. But like I said, the main thing is, because you're planting so intensely, you need to watch out what you could be shading out, and you also do need to put in a little bit of extra fertilizer, whether it's slow release fertilizer or compost or something, again, because it's so closely packed, you want to make sure that there's enough nutrition to go around. Okay, so now this brings me up to essentially monoculture. So yes, monoculture is typically associated with very large agricultural organizations and stuff, but you can technically do it in your own garden. You can plant out only tomatoes, whatever you want. But that's not really how I'm going to discuss it. I'm not going to talk about these long blankets of a single type of crop. Where monoculture is applicable in a gardening sense. So, for example, where I planted my tomatoes, where I planted my corn, even where I've got my bell peppers, technically you can consider that as a monocultured area, right? Because I have an area where there's only a single type of crop. So where this really comes into play is, let's say you have a lot of space, or you want to have like things with like things to ensure that they all get the correct amount of sun, the correct amount of nutrition, the correct amount of sunlight and stuff, then a monocultured sort of area becomes quite appropriate, because then everything here has the same requirements, everything here has the same requirements, so on and so forth. So if you have, let's say, a small bed of 1.2 by 1.2 meters, I think that's 4 feet by 4 feet, and then you have that block allocated to corn or to bell peppers or to onions or whatever, you can consider that as a monoculture. What makes it nice and appropriate is that, again, because you have a lot of things there that have the same requirements, it's the same crop, then it just makes it a little bit easy to know how to deal with it in terms of pests, watering and nutrition. What I have found is where I've been intercropping stuff, it has become challenging to ensure that everything gets the right amount of water, gets the right amount of sun, without drowning something or without starving something. So it at least helps in that sort of respect. Alright, so that brings me up to intercropping. So with intercropping, I mentioned it basically just now. All the intercropping is, you have an area with multiple varieties of plants in that area. It could be tomatoes with basil and marigolds and some spring onions. Really doesn't matter what you plant there, technically speaking, as long as you have different varieties of crops in an area that's intercropping. Where intercropping becomes very appropriate is where you have very limited space. You don't want to grow a lot of a single variety, but you want a lot of varieties. That's when intercropping becomes quite powerful, because then you can have, let's say, 3 tomato plants, you can have 1 basil plant, 1 coriander plant, a spot of chives, then you can have a whole bunch of other stuff around it. What you do want to watch out for, like I mentioned just now with the monocropping, is you want to try and arrange it in a way that the plants have similar requirements. If they have very different requirements, it becomes very difficult to ensure that everything is being treated the way they need to be. That's what I found. I've drowned out a few things, I've starved a few things because of intercropping, and I couldn't really change how I approached everything because it was quite tight, quite close together. So it is definitely a danger. But it is very powerful if you want a lot of varieties and you have limited space. Okay, so let's talk about a bit of a fun one now. I don't really know what to call it, but think about like a market farm. They have all these like rows, these very long rows that they'll plant stuff in. I really like that idea. I think it looks very cool. I think it looks really, really sick, and I really want to try and do it. And I've been thinking about it, right? You don't really need tons of space to do it. You just need an area where you can have a single row of stuff, Whether you monocrop within that row, whether you intercrop within that row, whether you square foot garden within that row, doesn't really matter. The nice thing is with having a single row of stuff down, especially if it's like positioned right, then everything has the required amount of sun. With everything being in one single area, it also becomes very easy to lay down irrigation systems by having a single row down. And when I say single row, right, let me just quickly clarify. I'm not saying a single row of plants. I'm saying a single bed going down, or maybe like 2 or 3 beds, whatever, but then there's space, but they're all in these sort of nice long rows. It just becomes very efficient to plant everything out, becomes very organized to plant everything out. Spacing becomes very easy, laying down irrigation systems becomes very easy. Having a wheelbarrow up and down for moving like compost and mulch and stuff becomes quite easy because it's a single line, bro. So I think it really has a space. If you have space in the garden, it really becomes appropriate. And the other thing is as well, if you have these long beds, right, putting infrastructure in place becomes a little bit easier, right? Because if you have like trellises or stakes, even like behind now, you've got these like pellet trellises, maybe some sort of vertical support, becomes nice and easy to organize them down a row, you know. So I think these, like, I don't know, market farm style rows, I don't really know what to call them, I think they look cool, and I think they really have a space, a spot in your garden if you have the amount of space to give them. Okay, so we're getting to some really fun stuff now. Before, I want to quickly discuss a container style garden, and it's something that I really want to try. So my orchard, right, okay, I've got a few fruit trees, right, but they're all in pots. The nice thing with having a container style garden, let's say you're renting a spot, or you're not sure that you're going to live there, wherever you are, you're not going to live there for a long time. Let's say you're going to be there for a few months, or maybe only a year or two. You don't want to do a whole bunch of work in the garden and then leave it behind, you know. So a container style garden really helps with that. And by having a container garden, you can put everything wherever they need to be. It becomes very easy to change. It's flexible, right? So let's say you've got tomatoes in a container, and you got, I don't know, a whole bunch of stuff in containers, and you put them in a location. Let's say after a week or so you realize, I need to change them up. They're not getting enough sun, or they're getting too much sun, or they're being exposed to a lot of wind, you know. It becomes very easy to move those containers around. Whether you're shifting the containers amongst themselves or moving them from point A, like from one spot in your yard to the other side, it becomes very easy. So container style garden really helps in that respect. The second thing is, because it's containers, you don't have to purchase a lot of material, not as much as like raised garden beds. And because it's only a small amount of material, it becomes very cost efficient. So if you aren't in a permanent location, or let's say you don't really have the money to just fork out for a whole new shebang, really. I mean, gardening can be expensive. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. You know, container gardens can be very efficient. And the nice thing is, you can still apply everything that we've just discussed to a container context. You can, if you have a large enough container, you can still do square foot gardening. If you have a large enough container, you can still do monocropping. You know, you can still plant corn in containers. You can still plant tomatoes in containers. You can still plant, like, if you have like these little small containers, you can put them around your balcony, put them on like windowsills and stuff, and grow carrots and spring onions and basil and coriander, a whole bunch of stuff in your kitchen, wherever you have the space. That's the nice thing with container gardening. Wherever you have space, you can just put a container. And let's say you have like an in-ground garden, you can still utilize containers. That's what I'm doing, right? So I've got basically my garden beds like in-ground for all the veggies. Then I've got the fruit trees in containers, and a few other things in containers because I don't really know where I want to put them. So it's just, I like the flexibility, and I think that's the biggest plus for container gardens. On the topic of infrastructure, it's not infrastructure, it's infrastructure. Okay, but we're going from container gardens to vertical style gardens. I'm specifically going to talk about green walls in this context because I think it's the most appropriate. Because this is, again, another way to organize things in a sort of garden bed. If you have a green wall, then you can plant a whole bunch of stuff vertically. You can have a whole bunch of green walls stacked next to each other, all that sort of stuff. And that really becomes powerful because, again, if you don't have the space, then you can utilize unused vertical areas. I mean, there's so much real estate on walls, dude. We're not using it. So green walls become very appropriate. What you do want to watch out for, right? Because things, obviously they grow up, right? And they hang over. What you would, once you sort of try and do is things that grow the shortest, you would want to plant them at the top. Otherwise, you're not going to reach them. And things that grow sort of tallest, you want to plant them at the bottom so they can essentially use that green wall as a trellis. The other thing that you can do is anything that sort of flops over, I don't really know how to say that, anything that'll flop over or have greenery that's a little bit more, I don't know, long and lanky, then you can plant them at the bottom, because then they'll hang over the sides and then not shade anything else out. And I think that's where vertical gardens really become powerful. You have a lot of flexibility in what you can plant where, and because it's a vertical space, you only need a very small sliver essentially of surface area for that. It's really, really cool, and you can stack them on top of each other, you can stack them on, beside each other. It's really, really cool. But like I said, what you plant within those little areas, that's really what you want to watch out for. You don't want to shade everything out, and the stuff that will typically require more water, that'll also go at the bottom, because depending on the type of vertical wall or green wall that you have, typically all the water will filter from the top down to the bottom. So you'll try and put your root crops, your more crops that require less water, more sort of Mediterranean climates, you'll put those at the top, and then everything else that requires a lot of moisture, carrots and stuff, then you'll put them at the bottom. Now here's a cool one. Do you guys know about food forests? That's such a cool idea. But yeah, so the other way that you can organize your stuff is food forests. Essentially what it is, it's like a whole permaculture business. What a food forest attempts to do is to try and mimic nature. So you'll have essentially anything that grows very tall, typically like a tree, like a fruit tree or something. It'll be your top canopy, so that'll get planted in spot A. It'll grow up, and then around it you will then have gradually getting smaller canopies of stuff. So around the base of the tree you'll have maybe some small shrubs of like berries and fruits and stuff, and then below that then you'll have other stuff like peppers and stuff, sort of like medium to small height crops, and then below that you'll then have other stuff like your lettuces and your root crops and stuff. All it does is you have this sort of gradients, right, of heights stacking up from everything that's very low down onto the ground, like I said, carrots, root crops, spring onions, and then you'll start having slightly taller stuff that'll afford them shade, stuff like peppers and broccolis and cauliflowers and kales and that sort of stuff. And then maybe a bit taller than that you'll have then, I don't know, like your massive squashes and your like gooseberry bushes and that sort of stuff, your tomato plants and stuff, and then you'll have your massive fruit trees, because everything then just filters down, everything gets a good amount of sun, because then again, the way everything is organized, something will shade something out and give them enough shade so that they don't burn out. Typically that's the low ground stuff. And then yeah, I don't really know how to explain it. I don't know too much about food forests. I just really like the concept, and that's such a cool idea. Where it really becomes powerful is, again, if you have a lot of space and you really intend to go the self-sufficient route, you sort of want to go the food forest route. Because it tries to mimic nature, it tries to reduce the amount of human input that you need to do. You'll sort of want to try and perennialize things. And it's really cool because then you can really have like a literal food forest. Man, I've seen videos, right, where people walk down these like little pathways and it's just food here and food here and food here. Man, it's so cool. Food forests. So that's pretty much the video. As you can see, there's quite a few different ways to go about this, and it all really comes down to what you have available in terms of space and what your objectives are for the garden itself. There's pretty much a method for everyone in every scenario, which is really nice. It really gives you a lot of flexibility. So my recommendation is really just pick one of the easiest ones, something that you really think will give you a lot of bang for your buck, something that can that you get really excited about, and yeah, pretty much just take it from there. Yeah, so if you enjoy hearing me ramble on about random gardening stuff, I recommend you check out my playlist.